Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us for this most interesting discussion in the day that has to do with planetary health. Now, if you're wondering what planetary health is, well, beyond the obvious, like Ruli said earlier, the title of this session of our conference has to do with interconnections is telling. It is interconnections and relationships. One of those relationships, probably the most inextricable of them all, and probably not the first that pops to mind, especially for us who belong to the Western or developed world, in inverted commas, is the relationship with the environment and the planet. By the way, it is the World Day for Global Health, and we had climate crisis was the result of our actions that came as a reminder that despite this arrogant opinion that we own this planet, we are the species that manages the entire planet and that the entire planet is aimed at serving them, these are our own actions that have an immediate impact on the planet and that return to us. So the relationship is a two-way one. It's symbiotic, and the circle is a vicious one. We're at a point where we can clearly see the direct and indirect consequences, always serious consequences, on the importance of the health of the people. The WHO estimates that approximately 25% of deaths worldwide are environment-related, which brings us to the term planetary health. How does climate crisis affect health? We'll have a brief introduction, and will be offered by the Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Frontiers, and please roll the video. It's very informative.
When the weather becomes warmer and rainfall patterns change, insects like mosquitoes that transmit diseases such as malaria and chikungunya breed faster and survive in places they didn't before, exposing more people to these potential killers. It's been estimated that climate change will cause approximately 15 million additional cases of malaria each year. Dengue fever is also potentially deadly viral disease transmitted by mosquitoes. It is spreading rapidly, with reported cases increasing almost tenfold in the last 2 decades. The virus is now present in over 100 countries. The changing climate also means we will see more ticks and the diseases they carry, like Lyme disease. The life cycle and number of ticks are strongly influenced by temperature. When there's little water, we can't grow and produce food. On the other hand, too much can bring more pests and diseases that damage crops. Heavy rains can also destroy entire harvests. Livestock and plants we depend upon for food can't be raised without water. Rising seawater levels bring salty water to coastal areas, making agriculture impossible. All this means our food production systems will be affected, and this can cause or increase malnutrition, even in places there was none before. Natural disasters are becoming more frequent and severe. When extreme weather events like cyclones and floods hit, they can cause injury, death, and deadly diseases like cholera. Cholera, hepatitis E, and other illnesses can spread through water, so when we drink it or come into contact with it, we get sick. As the air, freshwater sources, and oceans become warmer, this leads to an increase of pathogens that cause diarrheal diseases. They're one of the most important causes of death in children around the world. The rising temperatures will cause increased heat-related illnesses like heat stress and heat stroke. The most at risk are the very young, the very old, and people with chronic conditions such as heart, lung, and kidney disease. This is worrisome, as heart disease is the #1 cause for death worldwide. Heat waves are becoming more frequent and severe. The last decade has included the hottest years on record. Air pollution is a great concern to our health. It's the cause of 9% of all deaths worldwide. Children are particularly vulnerable. Air pollution is closely linked to climate change. The extraction and burning of fossil fuels is a major source of air pollutants, and many of them cause global warming. Wildfires also produce a range of harmful air pollutants, known to cause cancer and increase the risk of heart attack or stroke. Climate change will also affect our health in indirect ways. When resources are scarce, they become a reason for conflict, and conflict forces people from their homes. There are often many different reasons why conflict erupts and why people decide to leave their home. Climate change contributes to this and makes existing grievances worse. As you can see, climate change is a serious threat to human health. The World Health Organization estimates 250,000 more people will die every year because of climate change-related health impacts. Everybody will be affected by climate change, but some are more at risk than others. The most vulnerable will be the least able to cope. We know because we're already seeing them in our waiting rooms.
So this lays the foundation for the discussion, the debate for our country as well. It's a new thing. So I would like to start with Professor Synolakis. What are the key planetary events? What are the key human activities that have affected that much the planet's balance, the equilibrium, thus affecting human health? Brilliant question, but before I get to this, I should like to be allowed to say that I saw the title of this conference, Headwinds. And I thought that the winds on the planet Venus, compared to its rotation, are approximately 250 times stronger than those on Earth. Venus, at one time, had conditions, or at least we believe, similar to those of the Earth. But there was a runaway greenhouse effect, which, in essence, made the planet Venus have a temperature that is approximately 500 degrees Celsius and approximately 900 times that of, or rather the pressure on the surface is as though you were at a depth of 900 meters. This happened suddenly. Now, I don't know how many years or hundreds or thousands of years, because in spatial time this is relative. It happened relatively fast. So what happened at some point was a feedback loop and things got out of hand. This is exactly what we're trying to avoid. What are the things we can see now? The beautiful video you rolled covered many of the things that I wanted to say. So this is exactly what we want to avoid. I heard many of the previous speakers say that we're all talking about a level of companies, countries. Now it's the whole planet that is involved and it's in danger. The planet per se. The planet will always be what it is. The conditions may change. Let's hope that we will never reach Venus-type conditions. The problem is, how will we be able to live humanely, and what are the conditions that can affect our health? Apart from the things that we heard and saw, of course, the increase of natural disasters, various diseases, from malaria and dengue fever. A thing that was not mentioned and that should be of concern is permafrost. Now, you know, in Greece we don't even have a name for permafrost. The northern, you go more north to the north, you know, because we have the Arctic Circle. It's approximately 30 degrees. If you start from the north, we're approximately at 60 degrees. Now, if you start from the North Pole and go 30 degrees southwards, it's the Arctic Circle. There, the Earth remains for the last 3 meters of the Earth and maybe up to kilometers. they are constantly frozen. It's a constantly frozen soil. So if we were to go back millions of years, in essence, this soil contains samples from microorganisms, microbes and viruses that existed back then. So the nomenclature attributed is Methuselah, viruses and microbes. Why Methuselah? Because, well, they have lived so far, and scientists were able to resuscitate viruses that were of 100,000 years of age. As you can understand, here we have the viruses, and I'm entering the turf of Professor Kotanidou. Many of those viruses and microbes we've never seen them. We don't know antibiotics for them. We don't know what resistances we could have, but it would be something similar to what we saw with the coronavirus. It's something that we don't know. It's something that we're not familiar with. And even if one were to add this to everything else we saw, the fact that by the melting of permafrost and with the fact that these things will be reintroduced in our atmosphere, in our ground. There will be viruses and microorganisms that we haven't seen for hundreds of thousands or even for millions of years. You realize that we are entering uncharted waters, unmapped waters. And this is of grave concern because literally we don't know what we're up against. And this is a very important part of planetary health. In addition to all that, that we saw on this very interesting video. Now, Mr. Karapanagos, Doctors Without Borders are where we can see this impact on human health. Could you please describe, in your own words, how you see this interconnection on the field? What are these direct and indirect impacts? I mean, the reality experienced by the people on site. It is true that we work in the global south, this area that is tormented by the impacts, and more directly than we are. We have mechanisms in the north to deal with it. In the south, things are different. What is of interest, and we saw this in the video, is that we who are there since the 70s, it took us a very long time to make the connection. What planetary health is here to say are two very important things. The first is the scale and the complexity of our society as to the natural environment. And the second is that the human interaction starts to bring to the surface threats that we never had thought about or that we would never have dealt with. Similar to the permafrost melting problem is the problem with deforestation that we have in Africa or in the Amazon. There are huge populations of animals that are isolated with their own flora and fauna, are being brought in contact with the human population. And it is highly likely, if not the pandemic that we experienced, that surely one of the recent Ebola epidemics was of that nature. And it's more often than not that this can allow us to make a surveillance, as it were, of the possibility of a new pandemic breaking out. A new Ebola pandemic is to follow what happens to the bats and monkey populations and other animals that are near or that are coming closer to human societies. I should like to reiterate that the scale, the fact that the human population has increased to that extent, which is a good thing, because the conditions we're living in are much better than they were any time in the past, distant or close. But we have created an overconsumption, and all this has started influencing and impacting and affecting negatively the natural resources. Mr. Vretos says this quite correctly. It's the complexity and the interconnection of all these things that has abolished the traditional linear way in which we were thinking. Things were simple. Something would rise, another thing would dwindle. Something would drop, another thing would rise. And now the courses and the lines or the etiology of all these things are much more complex, and a small shift in a single point might bring about a huge change in another point. And the last thing we said, that human interaction starts making new dangers surface. Professor Kotanidou, do we see these dangers in our country? Are there cases you have seen in the ICUs in Greek hospitals in which this disturbance of the relationship between human and nature is apparent? First of all, I would like to start from the interesting video we saw. Watching this video, all of us, well, Westerners, think that this is something that has to do with the third world. This is not something that will ever reach us. We're sheltered, we're protected. So on the 14th of January 2020, when the WHO notified about the emergence of a new coronavirus, potentially hazardous, was the words in Wuhan, China. We all thought that, well, China is so far away, no way it's going to come this way. And when a mere few months later, the WHO announced that this is a pandemic, and we saw the pictures in Italy, and luckily for us in Greece, because had we not seen those pictures, I don't think that we as Greeks would have taken this pandemic seriously. So we came to realize that what we were watching on films, on movies, on documentaries are here. They're in our country. They're next to us. They kill people. They kill our relatives, our friends, and there's not something drastic we can do. Like Mr. Synolakis said, it was perfectly unknown. In year one, what we did was to learn what this thing is that came in and started killing people, and we can't even understand why it's killing them. At the same time, we were looking for something that can deal with it in an effective way. Luckily, science, as of late, has made tremendous progress, which is why we managed in a very short period of time, which is less than a year, to come up with a vaccine that, even as we speak, is one of the very few weapons we have in our armamentarium against COVID-19. What we saw on the video about malaria or dengue fever or Zika, these things are not extraterrestrial, they're not alien, we can see them in our country. Lucky for us, they're still kept at very low levels, but we shouldn't forget that we often think about the Western Nile fever, or we have cases, or we had an area just a few years ago that had a lot of a huge malaria incidents. For our country, these were things that were totally unknown, they were unusual, which is why I believe planetary health has to do with everyone, both the Western world and the developing one. And we should not watch those pictures and say it's none of my concern. Right, so Mr. Karapanagos, I would like to ask, could you please give us some concrete examples from your experience on the field? I watched the news yesterday, and it had cyclones in Canada, floods in India, even in Pakistan, typhoons in Japan and the Philippines. And this is just a very small part of from what we saw from all this disturbance and this imbalance on the planet. Can you give us some other incidents so that we can understand what it is you have to deal with? Well, in my first mission in 2018 in Congo, the first question I was asked by the medical director of the team was, we see much more frequently now these periodic epidemics of cholera we used to have, and at the same time, malaria had started spreading much more over time. The duration of the epidemic we have, it is an endemic situation there. So it has peaks throughout the year that's increased in duration. So when you say endemic, you mean like the flu here? Yes, precisely. Every year we expect a very large number of people, especially in children. As the people grow and are exposed time and again to malaria, they acquire some sort of immunity. But the children are terribly burdened and bothered by it. And that was the key problem. So I went there because nutritional epidemiology was my thing, and I didn't have much to do with those diseases. And when I got there and I had to deal with cholera, I was flabbergasted. I said, wait, what? And what we could see was that, well, Africa, over the past few years, has a ginormous internal immigration. The people have left small villages, the small communities they were living in, and they have moved to the big cities. This, in and of itself, is an explosive factor that affects adversely all these contagious diseases, communicable diseases. And, well, the temperature in the lakes changes. So the problem with cholera was in what we call large African lakes. It's where the cholera plasmode is endemic in. And the more the temperature rises, this can multiply more easily and infect people. A similar scenario runs for malaria as well. The conditions change in a way that makes the microbes and the viruses more resilient and resistant, and the conditions allow them to multiply more easily and faster. These diseases are one of the most important problems we can see. But these, well, we're used to hearing about them. It's in the narrative that we're used to, and we combine them with climate change. Planetary health has another bit to add, which is that of immigration and migration. The populations that are forced to abandon their headquarters in conditions of very low health coverage and to have even worse health conditions is what makes this mixture explosive. So is migration the key role? Because one may say, well, why should I care what happens in Congo? How can that affect me in Athens, on Mytilene or on Tylos? That's a very important question. It's very important indeed, and it has two entirely different answers. One of them is purely humanitarian. I mean, you should care because they're people too. Okay, I mean, to me, this is crystal clear. I mean, empathy and even a sense of responsibility that many of the problems that these people have are due to the way that the global North has behaved is a part of the answer to the question, why care? But you can see it from the video and from what Mrs. Kotanidou presented is that we are all in it together. We're interconnected, we're interlinked. Whatever happens in one point of the planet can reach us here in zero time. Mrs. Kotanidou, there are polio cases in England or in other parts of the world. I mean, this has to do with how countries can protect their populations from health threats, correct?
Well, listen, the last 2.5 years, we all operate in the framework of COVID. And many lockdowns were affected, which on one hand did good because we restrained the pandemic, but on the other hand, they more or less sterilized us within inverted commas. And this brought about what you described, that is, all doctors consider that polio is something that has vanished. We will not see it again. And here we are. In northern London, there are children with polio, and now vaccination becomes compulsive today in 2022 for kids up to 9 years, which for us was like the videos that we watch from Africa. It's not only polio. We'll also see a lot of other diseases which we consider that were vanished for good. We saw, for instance, that this year we had in our country cases of flu in August. This would never happen. Now we tell people go to take the flu vaccine. They will all say, why? Flu will have in March or February. But we saw that in August we had such cases for the first time. So everything has changed. We no longer have those borders that in January we'll have this one. That was the predictions. That was the forecast for these diseases in Greece. Now we are in a planet which is interconnected and it's under attack. What happens in Attica can happen in Greece immediately. Mr. Synolakis, within this overall condition of climate crisis and what we are discussing, there's also another factor having to do with the geopolitical developments, the war in Ukraine, and solution of need, if you like, that many countries make, as well as Greece, in traditional forms of energy. Is this something? Is this a well-documented risk? A weighed risk, a calculated risk, or is it something really dangerous? Well, it's kind of a Faust dilemma. We all know the history of Faust. We all know what happened. And we all know that at the end of the day, Faust did get what he desired, but he had to pay the bill, to have to foot the bill, and there was a problem. Of course, in the history of Faust, there's a kind God that forgives him and actually tells the devil to stay put, and we've got the devil complaining. I don't believe that we'll have the same ending like Faust. Personally, I'm against any kind of such kind of Faustian bargain. In other words, all of a sudden, we have lignite in the limelight. Well, we had reached a point where, as a humanity, we had put lignite behind, the charcoal was behind, and even in Greece, we had the most optimistic scenario for zero net moving towards 2030, 2050. 1.5 years in the National Committee on Climate Change, we were discussing of setting the threshold by 2025 to have all the lignite units closed. And there were some complaints not to do it immediately. And we wanted to have natural gas as a transition fuel. And now, not only did we offer new air to lignite units, but we also have new measures introduced for heating oil, while we had made a huge effort to have citizens, city residents, to convince them to replace the boilers, the oil boilers, and have them transformed to natural gas boilers. Now we turn back. We realize that there are political needs and experiences, but on the other hand, this is not something happening solely in Greece. It happens all over Europe. But the results of this turning back haven't been fully assessed and taken into the equation, I believe. Of course, on the other hand, we see an acceleration of a transition to RES, which is good. Now, what will happen in due course? How long we will be thrown back? I don't know, but only the fact that symbolically we offer a breath of life to lignite and heating oil, this is not something positive or expected. Madam Kotanidou, to what extent what we've been discussing can you imagine, or how certain will be the future? We'll be ready in the next health crisis, because what we all discuss is that most probably we'll be having other epidemiological crises as well. So are we prepared for the next crisis to come? Well, at this point, science is intensively getting prepared for the new crisis. Do you know what that will be? Well, perhaps. We definitely know that there will be a new public health crisis. What we must all understand is that we must have trust put our trust in scientists. That's the main thing. What we witnessed during the pandemic was the fierce doubting of the very existence of physicians, of medicines, of vaccines. This was greatly doubted, and this really held us back, and very horrendous results and unnecessary toll. What is the basic, what the whole Europe and USA does, is that it prepares the medical society on how they must best address the oncoming health crisis. That is a great percentage of doctors and nurses is being prepared for dealing for this crisis. In the next crisis, there will not be specific specialties dealing with that. There will be far more greater number of scientists who will be ready to wage a war against the new crisis. Mr. Panagos, we also saw a change in the rationale and philosophy of the Doctors Without Frontières, introducing this planetary health notion. And because there's time pressure, I would please ask you to raise also the last question here that regards addressed to all of you. What is the responsibility of each and every one of us here individually? What is our responsibility so as to change the paradigm, the discussion? And this is the quest of the whole day, what each one can do separately, and what are the policies that should have a priority in this effort. I'll start with you, and I will conclude with the other speakers, the other panelists. Listen, for the Doctors Without Frontiers, we were also late as an extraordinary needs organization. We were viewing the problems at a small scale. We were late to realize how important this international interrelation was. We had all established our supply chain and resupply in traditional ways, which were very burdening for the environment. We ignored interventions which should have been far more locally designed. Therefore, there is a part regarding the organization and the footprint of this organization, the planet footprint. So we try to rationalize the medicines movement. We're a global organization, so we obviously send people everywhere. So this is one part. For me, however, what is most important from the medical viewpoint is that we have started having discourse with the local communities in a more direct way and plan our interventions in a way that we will include the mentality of the society. A great mistake that we always did, that we would go and visit those societies, us being the knowledgeable and dictating what should be done. This was wrong. This, for me, is the most important and good thing that I learned. I was taught like that in the university, but I saw it in practice in our missions. Now, what can we do? I do not know. What I wanted to say is that going back to cholera, we knew very well that cholera is a well-known disease. We know its cycle, the parameters affecting it. No matter how complex it is, we do have the pathways. What we used to see, and that's most interesting for me, is what we saw. We had a dramatic drop of the probability of cholera in a household, only with if soap existed in the house. Complex things are most important, that's true. COP26 is most important, everything. But in our part, simple things can really make the difference. Not only those, but I will limit myself in that. Madam Kotanidou, listen, the Western world must also differentiate his mode of thinking, his rationale. We have learned here in the West that if I have got something, well, I'll take a pill and it will be over. What we must learn is that medicine can also be a poison, and in Greek it's the same word with a different intonation. So we must do prevention, be in no need of drugs. And when we are to take, this must be absolutely necessary. We have the trend to go to the pharmacy and say, I've got some kind of flu, give me an antibiotic. There's no worse thing than us playing doctors. And the most willing pharmacists offer and present the antibiotic that might kill the COVID or whatever other virus. These are the huge mistakes that we now pay dearly. Currently, when we have a patient coming to the hospital, we have to search for the latest antibiotics because he has really developed such great resistance. Unfortunately, we have so many microbes and microbes in the hospitals which are antibiotic resistant. And unfortunately, these are the ones killing the people with a very vulnerable immune system. But we have caused that. We are responsible for all that. So we must wonder, each of us separately, and we must think, for what reason do I do this? Will I hurt someone else? Will I be killing my friend tomorrow because of this? I would like to come back to a point that Madame Kotanidou mentioned, that these pictures we see that may not be resonating with us, pictures from Africa, I must tell you that having spent my life studying extreme phenomena in situ and studying something, let me remind you, the Indonesia tsunami in 2004 killed 50,000 people. When we were watching those images, no one could imagine that the worst pictures of that we were to see in Japan 7 years later, in 2011. So what's the lesson to be taught here? We must always think the worst case scenario. I'm not telling you the scenario where we might have a comet collapsing, crashing on Earth and having the planet opening and crashing in two. But there are other scenarios that we don't do as scenario. Listen at Boeing, for instance, with the accident on 737. They had not studied all these scenarios because they believed they were very strange. Even if when they had the first accident in Indonesia, the first Boeing 737 that fell, many people thought that it was the pilots, they were not experienced, they were suicidal or whatever. And there, some months later, we saw a similar accident in Ethiopia. So all these things, there's so many things that we do not know that we cannot help but thinking the worst case scenario, and at the same time taking the appropriate measures. And in concluding, regarding our personal responsibility, recycle, reuse, reduce. These are the 3 R's that we've been learning in the university 40 years ago. We had forgotten that, and all of a sudden back. Climatic change is most important, both for people and companies. So recycle, reuse, reduce. Thank you. I thank you all for staying that late.